sacrifice, his death on the cross, what he did was he covered our sins. And those that believe in him have absolution. Because why? Because he took away all the evidence of everything we've ever done. Just like when he healed the servant's ear. There's no evidence when we stand before God of our wrongdoing. That's what he did for us. So we're all guilty. We've all committed crimes against God. And Jesus has done the one thing that can allow us into the kingdom, and that is take away all the evidence of our wrongdoing. But we have to believe in him for this to happen. The healing of Malchus's ear is important for two reasons. First, it does fulfill the saying, of them which thou gavest me, have I lost none. But it also gives us a picture of what Christ does for us. I think that's pretty obvious in what I've already said. But the only way we can be saved is through Christ. We know that. Through his sacrifice. So we must believe in him in order for this evidence to be taken away. But it can be taken away, and we are allowed to enter the kingdom because of what he's done for us. So just like the healing of the servant's ear, just like when he healed Malchus's ear and took away the evidence of Peter's crime, his death has taken away all evidence of our crimes against God so that we might enter the kingdom. So with that, if we could stand and be dismissed to our classes. Brother Keith, would you dismiss us?
Oh, Steve knows the trick. Thank you, sir. No one else could do it last week. No one else could do that. Good morning. Good to see you guys once again. We seem to be missing a few here, though. Maybe they'll be in later. I know Leslie and Jessica are not feeling well today, so messes up the birthday plans today. My mom's birthday, so guess won't be able to do that. 92, so still going pretty strong. Physically, there's starting to be some issues, so ask for prayer for her, some of my family as well. We are continuing in our study regarding I'll say the trial of Jesus. We're not there yet. We're talking about it. I don't think I'll really be there till next week because we're sort of laying the groundwork for some of these things that we don't know. The details are not given to us in the scriptures, and so some of these things I find for myself fascinating. Very interesting. And we talked last week about the fact that the Jews, Israel, prided themselves on their justice system. In fact, there's a statement later I highlighted. I think it said the Sanhedrin, it was to save and not to condemn. Was to save life. Because as you see, we started to go into some of it. They wanted to lean on the side of justice or leniency. That's not a good word. On the side of against error. So they did everything they could in many ways, and we'll see, to not unjustly convict someone. Not so in the case of Jesus, but that was their general ideal, shall we say. And I mentioned last week the Sanhedrin made up of 70 members. I guess there's chief priests, Sadducees, Pharisees, and then ultimately the high priest would be the 71st vote. Although I've read, a little bit different in the numbering. I don't know. It's hard to say. There's always somebody with a little different opinion, I guess, or idea. And so this Sanhedrin, which we knew, or we mentioned last week, there were Sanhedrins in every city that had enough qualified men, 120 qualified men, heads of household, shall we say, that could make up a local Sanhedrin. And then they had the great Sanhedrin, which was the one in the temple, of course, with the 70 members and such, who ultimately decided cases that could not be decided on a local level, along with other things. And let's face it, they were not just a religious body, they were a political body. And so right there you're going to see why much of the problems existed with the Sanhedrin, at least in the days of Jesus. Well, before that, it really began to happen in their occupation of Rome. So they had to do some things, and because they were oppressed and occupied people, and had to get along with the government of Rome, and so they became more political. And again, we'll see some of that, I guess. Three things we mentioned last week, or I mentioned, guaranteed under a trial by the Sanhedrin, a capital trial in particular, especially, but number one, it was a public trial. So nothing hidden, nothing secret, right? Number two, they had the right of self-defense, so you could have an attorney, so to speak, right? A public defender that could help. And you had the right to defend yourself if you needed to or decided to. And then thirdly, no one could be convicted of any crime, such as, well, certainly capital crime, without 2 or 3 witnesses. And that was imperative. And they were very strict on it, generally, as I say. Remember I mentioned false witness. Being a false witness was a serious crime, especially in capital cases, because the end result was if you gave false witness, you became the one guilty. You were subject to the same crime you're accusing the person of crime, the accused party. Very important. And you know, you think about this, and even as Brother Hall has mentioned, God hates liars. God hates the lie. And why wouldn't he? Because he is all truth. He is the ultimate, right? And there is, if it is not true, sorry, God, it doesn't fly by God. Nothing does, right? It can't. His holy, righteous nature. And so he abhors lying. And so a false witness is an abomination when you think about it, and especially, of course, in capital claims or other crimes where they could be beaten or imprisoned or whatever. That's a horrible thing. Think about that. That there would be people that would falsely accuse you for things, and to the point of, you know, taking you to court and you be subject to these things. And and so I think about it. I think about the idea of the system of justice that depends on truth, right? a system of justice, jurisprudence that depends on true witnesses, right? And so we think about the justice when you don't have that. And in fact, I was studying for the lesson and reviewing it again, and I just, on a side note, I grab my notepad and, what's this question? I write it down and I start to go through it. I get caught up in a lot of those sometimes that takes me away from the root lesson, but they're pertinent to the lesson, at least in my mind. And so it got me thinking about any justice system. And it's the idea that, we talked about justice as blind. And think about the basic premise behind that, and how important that is in a country made up of diverse people and backgrounds and abilities and needs and goods and services, whatever they have. But our justice system, or any justice system really, is only as good as the ones entrusted to ensure that justice, right? And so, to ensure that justice is properly enforced, that the standards of justice are held up, and as we see here, and as we'll be seeing in the Sanhedrin, in this trial of Jesus, they weren't, right? But it's because the players involved were corrupt, right? If they weren't corrupt, what would have happened? Well, probably, technically, any other case, let's say, or without this being God's plan, shall we say, God's will, Jesus would have been acquitted. They didn't have anything on him. He would have been set free. And just think about, and it made me think about the fact, what if Pilate would have said, I find no fault in him, I've set him free? What would have happened? Well, we know we might be in trouble if that was the case, unless there's something else come up that took Jesus to the cross. But why are there injustices? And even looking at this one, and we're going to get into it a little bit because it's fascinating to me again. I hope it helps you guys too. This behind the scenes thing, I really enjoy, and hadn't heard and read these things before. And so it kind of opened up some avenues of discussion in my mind. Why is there injustice to begin with? When we think about justice as blind, and these laws are created so that all men created equal, all men subject to the same laws, ideally, right? That's how it all was set up. But then you bring into all this, you have certain prejudices. Now, some of that's racial, but not all prejudice is racial, right? We have our own biases, prejudices based on our ideas and ideals, whatever, and background and circumstances in our life. So there are other prejudices, right? Hatred, right? Greed. And you say, well, what's that got to do with anything? You don't think greed's involved with injustice? We haven't seen what's been going on out there, huh? And corruption. When I mention greed and corruption goes hand in hand. Corruption. But corruption is not always for money, right? Power, right? So think about all those things that go into the idea of justice and what we hope to have when we have to face, if we ever have to face the court, certainly. And I mentioned the idea, just as an example, the Trump situation. There are those out there on both sides, and in particular, a couple of them very liberal. The Jewish law man, I see his face. You guys know who he is. And then there's, both names escape me. There are people out there that are stunned at how some of these things came about against Trump. Never done before. Just manipulations of things and procedures and laws, even adding laws or amending laws, just things never done. They're stunned that they would rise to that level. Why do you think they rise to that level? hatred, prejudice, corruption, power, right? They're not when political powers are in charge of your justice system and you're on the other side, will you get justice? You know, all those kinds of things. And it's not just that. When they look at our courts and judges that in particular involved, but now we have to look at our FBI, our CIA, our Secret Service, our Homeland Security, and we realize, where's the justice, right? What's going on here? And we see wholesale corruption, and that's not good. That's not good for us. We're going down. We're so far down a really bad place. I don't know that any one person can fix it. Well, they can't. And maybe stem the tide. But we'll see what happens. And of course, if it doesn't go, if it doesn't go with Trump this time around and goes to the most liberal president and vice president out there, we're doomed as a nation. There's no coming around that. So, it's how important is justice? It's blind justice, you know, and truth as we talk about it. So, just keep that in mind, I guess, as well. There is an example. Some of you may know there are things going on in Great Britain right now. I won't detail it today, but they have real problems, and they're further along than we are in some of this stuff. Now, interesting enough, by the way, so those three things, they were guaranteed for trial. But you know, there's a third part I did not know about, and that is when there's a capital case and sentence is going to be pronounced. Did you know they couldn't pronounce it on the same day? You know they couldn't pronounce it till the third day. They gave a day in between the idea of whether he was judged guilty before sentence was carried. They gave a day in between, and the third day they came back and convened. Was anything changed, anything different? And they continued with that discussion and proceeded forthwith, right? Why'd they do that? Well, you can think about it. So, for example, today I'm convicted of capital crime. The sentences are entered. But tomorrow it'd be a break. The justices would not convene. They wouldn't. In fact, they were to abstain from some things. In fact, they were to fast. Actually, were to fast because they're dealing with a very serious crime, and a person would be put to death. And so on the third day, they'd reconvene, and they reconfirm a death penalty. Right? So think about that. And by the way, one of the things about that was they were heading into a Passover. There was not supposed to be any death that day. They should have waited another day to the third day, actually, from that day. So it's very interesting. And I also mentioned, I guess, I have a quite a line here, but Deuteronomy 17, when we talked about the idea of justice in carrying out the crime and the witnesses. The other part about the false witnesses, remember, and I mentioned this last week, I did jump ahead slightly, was that not only were you required to tell the truth, and if you were deemed guilty of false witness, even in a capital murder case, you were condemned to death. That's how strong the Lord felt about the truth and putting another person's life on the line, right? Pretty important. But here's the other part, Deuteronomy 17:7, the hands of the witnesses shall be first upon him to put him to death, and afterwards the hands of all the people. So thou shalt put the evil away from you. We mentioned last week. You're not only the accuser, if you're the false accuser, well, the accuser has to realize they're going to be the first ones to throw the stones. And if you're a false accuser, you're not only guilty of false testimony, you're guilty of murder because you've now killed an innocent person that you knew, right? And so that's pretty important. Actually, vitally important, isn't it? Okay? And so, and I mentioned that last week. I mentioned that, you know, a woman wouldn't be a witness. Just in those things, especially, I don't know in every case, but certainly capital cases, because they didn't think they would be willing to throw that stone, you know. No child, of course, or immature, irresponsible person, I mean, of young age, a slave couldn't, infirm or someone of not right mind couldn't do those kinds of things. So it's very important. And by the way, when these witnesses are testifying, one of the things they would ask them, and these are excerpts from historical documents that they're writing about. As I said, a couple of writers writing on these things in particular. They have to attest, it says, to the identity of the party, to depose to the month, the day, the hour, and the circumstances of the crime. So it's not like, I think it was here or then or thereabouts. Remember, we had a Supreme Justice accused of some things, and the woman said, I don't remember when. I just know it happened. Literally was her testimony. And they threw that all out, tried to work up a case against them. They couldn't do that. They needed to know specifics. So they're very, very specific and detailed about the information that they would get from people as a witness. And so no hearsay, anything like that, right? Had to be approved. And if the guilty wanted to, or the accused wanted to speak, he could speak on his own behalf, give his own explanations. He could address the judge and the people gathered there. Again, it's an open trial. People are there, right? It's in the daytime. People are there. That's a fair trial. And so they really learned, I guess leaned on the merciful side. Again, trying to ascertain everything they can. And if there was anyone other than a judge wanted to speak, they could only speak on behalf of his innocence. They could not just willy-nilly out there start accusing and saying things about the accused because they didn't want, again, they didn't want to start the emotion. They didn't want to get everybody all worked up and become sort of a mob and have to deal with all that. So they're very careful about how they conducted the trial. They didn't want that emotional response. And when the accused spoke, they paid attention. They wrote things down. There were scribes there throughout the entire process that wrote everything down. One of the scribes wrote down at the count came, wrote down the guilty. One of the scribes wrote down the innocent vote, and they would tally them up and that kind of things. I had noted that out of the 70, 23 is considered a quorum. And I don't know, for some reason it said 13. If acquitted, he was instantly released. But if he was found guilty, they couldn't do anything until the third day. They abstained. And that was important. That's just to give you, they weren't supposed to get involved in any feast or drinking, what have you. Their minds were to be reflecting on the case and itself and such. Then on the third day, they were returned to the judgment seat. They would sit, and they would ask each judge there what their opinion was, if it had changed or not. They would state either way. You could change your mind from guilty to acquittal, but you couldn't change your mind from acquittal to guilty. If you made that declaration, I don't know why, just the way they had it. Again, leaning on the side of mercy. And that third day, if they found him still guilty of a capital crime, he was immediately taken out to be executed. They didn't put him in jails, like that. It was a speedy execution. Ecclesiastes 8:11, if you recall, you know the scripture. Because sentence against an evil work is not executed speedily, therefore the heart of the sons of men is fully set in them to do evil. Right? So we talk about the right to a speedy trial. It's a little different than speedy execution, but it's sort of all hand in hand, I guess. We're so messed up. We've got people, as I said, in jail from January 6th of not this year, last year, or was it? Is it now a year and a half? This is nuts. This is wrong. It's such an injustice. So we mentioned that I think gave you a little bit last week on what happens on the day of the execution. So they sit at the judgment hall, and I guess the gate is there's a gate facing out. I don't know exactly where they went, not too far away from there, because as they went out, I'll just read this. They had an officer at the Hall of Justice, Judgment Hall, with a flag in his hand. A second officer of justice got on a horse and rode after the party headed for the execution. He followed the prisoner, constantly turned around, looked back at the man with the flag. During this interval, if any person came to announce to the Sanhedrin any new evidence in favor of the prisoner, the first officer would wave his flag and they'd stop and they'd come back, right? They would. Then it says, if the prisoner declared to the magistrates that he recollected some reasons which had escaped him during this process, they brought him before the judge not just once but multiple times. These things could come up to be re-evaluated or such. And so here's the other part. When they went forth out from the gate, there was a herald. And a herald would declare the guilt of this person. And it would also say, he would also declare if there's anyone here that knows otherwise. Sort of like speak or forever hold your peace kind of a thing. And they would stop. And they would hear what was to be said. Right? And, let him come forth quickly as they announced this person heading to his execution. And so, again, leaning on the merciful side as such. And then, if nothing deterred them from that, however far out they went away from that spot, the gate there, they would give him or her some drug of some sort, stupefying drink, and they would, to dull their senses, and they would proceed to stone them to death. So, pretty interesting. Think about all the effort that typically would go into in this system of justice that the Sanhedrin held to. Now, understanding all this, you would think, well, if I was going to be in their hands and I was charged of a crime, especially if I was innocent, I would say, well, I'd have a pretty good shot at working this out, right? The Sanhedrin's going to hear my case. I'll have a chance for justice, right? Well, it didn't work for the Lord, did it? I mean, what did they have against the Lord? Now, we're going to see some next week when we get into it. But here's the thing. They violated every single law that they had or process that they had in the trial of Jesus, right? And they did it willfully, right? So remember when I'm talking about justice and why you may not have justice sometimes? Because it's solely, we have our trust in those we put in charge to dispense justice, and if they are corrupt, then you better, grease their palms or whatever, or have favor with them, or good luck, right? Remember we talked about it in Amos and Obadiah, probably just about any Old Testament prophet. Remember the Lord, how upset he was that you were abusing the poor. When they came before you with a case for a pair of shoes, you'd convict them. You'd not give them justice. They'd sit on lay on their beds of ivory, ivory beds of luxury, and they wouldn't care about the people. And so they wouldn't dispense justice correctly, and the Lord held them accountable for it as a nation. And of course, God removed them from the land, as a matter of fact, right? And so, you think about it, in this trial of Jesus, we can say it had to be, and that's one of my questions. But understand that they condemned to death the only truly innocent person that ever lived on this earth. Can you imagine that? He's the only one who could stand before someone and not say, oh, I'm not guilty, but yet you're a sinner, right? You have all kinds of other things that people don't know about or whatever it might be, right? Doesn't matter. You're not truly, none of us are innocent. No man is innocent, but Jesus was innocent, truly innocent. You think about that. It was a mockery of justice. And it wasn't true in this case. So we had no criminal trial could be done at night. This one was, right? The judges who condemned him should have had a day in between and finalize this whole thing on the third day, which they did not do. There had to be witnesses, true witnesses against him, which we know wasn't the case. They couldn't even agree. There had to be a defense. He was given no defense, right? There was nothing. There was really no trial or no reason, no crime. And I was thinking, and again, I'm trying to think of what I want to cover this part before I mention it. Well, let's just mention this. The Lord basically had 2 trials that day, and within those 2 trials, you really had, there's 3 aspects, maybe even 3 parts of that trial, because he did the Jewish trial, so to speak. He did the Roman trial, right? And in each case, as the Jews determined how they were going to do this, they had to do it in such a way that the Romans would agree to put him to death, right? They weren't going to do it on the fact that he was the Messiah. They could care less, right? But they had to trump up another charge, of course, and that's how they do it. And even then, it probably wouldn't even have worked, except that Pilate eventually gave in because he was influenced by the people, by the mob, right? So what good is the judge? What's the difference? That's still mob rule, still injustice. He was afraid to let him go because you can't have the strife, the discontentment, the possible riot that would have happened. It would have reflected bad on him, and he could have easily been removed or even killed, allowing these things. And there were rebellions in Israel over the years, and they were put down harshly, forcefully. So the first trial we find, Jewish trial, he was taken to Annas, the former high priest. And then Annas sent him to Caiaphas. This is all during the night, right? And to Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin in the middle of the night. And then in the morning he was brought back in the council, to the Sanhedrin in daylight, to where they sort of, I guess we could say, mockingly finished the deal. But then when they're done with that, they send him off to the Romans, of course, and so they sent him to Pilate. And Pilate, knowing where he was from or heard where he was from, and said, well, that's Herod's district, I'll send you over to Herod. And he was sent to Herod, and we find that Herod wanted to hear from him and wanted to see some miracle. But Jesus didn't entertain him in that way, and Herod ended up mocking him and beating him and sending him back to Pilate. Right? So all these things were going on. And really being sent to Annas, Annas he's a former high priest, and I'll mention more in just a minute on him. But his purpose was basically, he was kind of like the grand jury. He came up with the indictment, right? And so once he got the indictment, he sent him over to Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin for the main trial in the night. And then after daybreak, they reconvened again to make it legal, as I said. And they probably only spent a few minutes. And they'd already done everything they needed to do. They'd already set their mind, already passed their sentence, what have you, before all of that. In fact, the reality was, think about it, in this case against Jesus, the sentence was already determined, right? They kind of had to find the crime. Sometimes that's the way these things unfortunately work, right? So as he's taken away, first as it says there in Matthew, led him away to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and the elders were assembled. Well, it's not quite it's accurate, but Matthew says they led him away to Caiaphas, but it's not that's ultimately what happened. But John tells us the real order of events here. He went to Caiaphas, but John 18:13 says, and led him away to Annas first. Now, here's the conspiracy, here's the intrigue, here's the mess that was going on. He led him away to Annas first, the high priest. He's not really the high priest technically, Caiaphas is. But who is Caiaphas? That's his son-in-law. Annas was high priest, and by the way, you're supposed to be elected the high priest forever, for life. For some reason, Caiaphas is no longer the high priest. So something, again, politics, something going on there. And I didn't have time to study what maybe perhaps all things were.